Hello and welcome. I'm going to have a talk with you about the latest thing that I've been working on called the Lantern TTRPG, and it's a rules light fantasy role-playing game, and it utilises as many dice as you can possibly want. So you can see on this example character sheet here, we've got, if I duck my head out of the way, you can see D4 all the way up to D100. And the base mechanic, if you like, is as you advance in skill, whether that be at fighting, carrying out tasks or sorcery, your dice that you roll, which needs to get over a target number, the dice that you roll increases along this dice train. So if you've got a target number of, say, 5, you're not going to roll over 5 with a D4 unless you've got some modifiers. You've got more chance of doing it with a D6 or above. So it gets easier the bigger the dice you're using. And that's the basic premise of how the system works. The game itself is set in a world with no sun and no moon. So the only light sources are man-made or natural fire, things like that. And if you're within the radius of the light, the primary radius of the light, then everything's fine. You can see, you can do everything at no penalty. If you are in the secondary area of the light, which is twice the primary area, you suffer a -1 penalty to do things because you can't quite see as well. And if you are beyond that radius, then generally things you can't do unless you can somehow see, or they incur a -4 penalty. So that's the kind of overview of what Lantern is about. So let's just have a little look about creating a character. So I'm just flicking through the PDF now, which is freely available. It's a playtest version. It's unlikely to represent the final version, which may feature new art and be available in a physical format as well. That's the intention. So a little bit of information about what's an RPG. I don't go into great detail about that. If you don't know what an RPG is, it's unlikely that you're going to find this and it be the first time you've ever encountered an RPG. So I won't waste any digital space telling you. A little bit of information about what Lantern is, the setting, some information on the dice. And then we get into characters. Now, currently there are 4 different characters you can play. They're called backgrounds. So you've got the Acolyte, the Guard, the Apprentice, and the Cutpurse. So it's kind of like the Acolyte is your cleric or your priest. Your Guard is your warrior or your fighter. The Apprentice is your sorcerer or warlock or wizard, and the Cutpurse is your thief or rogue. So let's just have a little look at. Let's go for the Acolyte. So the Acolyte gets awarded as starting task fight sorcery die, which is what I talked about before. So they get 1d4 for each. So when they're fighting, they're rolling 1d4. When they're carrying out a task, they're rolling 1d4. And when they're trying to recite their incantations, they're rolling 1d4. And we'll talk about that that shortly. They start with 5 hits, which basically means they can take 5 hits before they're dying on 0 hit points. They can go to a minus, but once you're in minus, you've got 2 rounds before you need to be revived or stop the bleeding, and if nobody gets you in time, you're dead. So feats, they are things that add bonuses to your it could be mainly your task die, but possibly your fight die or your sorcery die. So with persuade +1 there, anybody can try to persuade, but the Acolyte is slightly more persuasive, so he gets +1 on his die, and you can increase the pluses. You can increase the fight, the task, the sorcery die. You can increase your hits. You can increase your gold. You can do all of that with experience, EXP as we call it in London. So you can also see incantations. Now these are not available to all of the backgrounds, other than the 2 casters, if you like, which are the Acolyte and the Apprentice. So you get to choose one. You can either have Bless or Healing Hands for the Acolyte on starting your character. So let's just take a look at the Guard. Now you can see the Guard has a larger fight die. They're rolling 1d7, so you can see to start off with, every character starts with 1 defense, and armor adds to your defense. So if you've got some padded armor, it would add +1. So you could have 2 defense if you're wearing padded armor, and you roll your fight die against, you're trying to beat the target's defense value. So rolling 1d7 against 2, you've got a pretty good chance of hitting. And if you do hit, whatever the weapon is, it has a hit damage value, and that's how much of the damage gets through to your adversary, and they would take that in hits. So you can see that they don't have a task. Sorry, they don't have a sorcery die, and that's because they can't cast. So generally, if something doesn't have a die, they can't do it. So if it doesn't have a sorcery die, it can't do it. The Apprentice doesn't have a fight die. The fight die is slightly different because there's no reason at all why an apprentice couldn't punch somebody. So there's a slightly different scenario for the fight die, which we can talk about later. So you can see they choose from 2 slightly different incantations. So pretty much, other than choosing a cool character name, you've got your background, and you can start filling in the information on your character sheet to populate some of the fields in your character. So we've talked about the fight die, the task die, and the sorcery die. Those are collectively your action dice. So if you want to fight a target, you're using your fight die, and you are trying to score greater than the defender's defense value. If you do, it's a hit, and it causes the weapon's hit damage to your opponent. If you have no fight die, you can sacrifice your defense to advance 1 step on the dice train. So if you have no fight die, if we look down at the character sheet, you can see that they are the first die that they get to is a d4. So they would get a fight die of 1d4 if they sacrifice 1 defense point. If they've only got 1 defense, in other words they're totally unarmored, they just can't do it. They're a punch bag, and that's that kind of goes some way to mimicking their total lack of training in fighting, but they can just about fight if they're sacrificing their defense because they're leaving themselves open and that kind of thing. So task die, every time you want to do something that's not fighting or related to reciting your incantations, if you're a caster, the game master will decide on a target number to beat with your task die, and you may have some feats that add bonuses, modifiers to that. There may be some situational modifiers that the game master decides to introduce, such as penalties because it's slippy or whatever. But it works in the same way, so you roll your task die, add any modifiers, and you have to beat the task's target number. And then the sorcery die, every time you want to cast or recite an incantation, you roll your sorcery die, add any modifiers that you have, and you have to beat the casting value of the incantation, which is listed in that section. So that pretty much sums up the action dice. It's pretty straightforward, and you can spend experience later to advance a step on the dice train to improve your ability to either fight or carry out tasks or recite your incantations. So quick chat about gear. You've kind of got equipment, you've got weapons, and you've got armour. So equipment are things like 10-foot poles and lanterns and torches, things that give you some light in this world that's very dark. And with the weapons, you've got various weapons that you can take, and you can see that the amount of hits of damage that they do are listed, and different weapons have slightly different damages and ways that they work. So a spear, it does 1 hit of damage, although if it's used two-handed, it does 2 hits of damage, but you can't use a shield. It can also be thrown 30 feet. So there are specific rules for certain weapons. And then with armour, if you choose some heavier types of armour, they introduce a physical task and sorcery penalty, and this is a negative number that you apply to your task die if you're carrying out a physical task, or your sorcery die when you're trying to cast, where applicable. So obviously the higher armoured you are, the more penalty you're going to get, and so jumping in full plate whilst carrying a tower shield, it's -6 on your roll, and you're unlikely to be casting unless you get to advancing to be rolling d30s, in which case you're powerful and you're overcoming all of that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to talk about the experience, the EXP. So after every session that you play, irrespective of the length, it could be a 1 hour session if you like, or a 4 hour session, you gain 1 XP. And a game master may decide that it warrants you getting 2 XP. That's down to the game master. But you can spend that XP at any point in the game, midway in a session, however you want. And if you spend 1 XP, so after your first session, you could increase your coin by 20. So that's gaining 20 extra coin to spend on anything. You can increase a feat that you have by +1. So where we saw earlier that the Acolyte has a persuade of +1, he could make that +2. You can increase your hits by 1. Now if you're saving up, and you can spend 2 XP, you can choose a new feat that you don't have, providing it's not a natural feat, such as night vision or something like that. or more importantly, you can increase one of your action dice to the next die in the dice train, and that's a key one really. You could, if you spend 3, learn a new incantation, really useful for casters. Or if you don't have, say, a sorcery die, you can move from none to the first dice on the dice train. So you could learn sorcery for the cost of 3. Or if you have no fight dice, such as you're an apprentice, you could spend 3 XP to get 1 D4. So you don't have to sacrifice this defense if you're trying to defend yourself and and get an attack in for any reason. So that's experience. So we talked about light earlier and the fact that the setting has no sun and no moon, and that has consequences. If you can't see, it's pitch black pretty much. There may be some starlight, but it's minimal. Then you're at -4 to try and get anything, assuming it's even possible. If let's say we have a torch has a primary radius of 15 feet, and it has a secondary radius of double that, 30 feet. If you're within the primary radius, then everything is fine, you can function normally. If you are in the secondary radius, then you're at -1 to things that rely on seeing properly. There are also some creatures that we call light haters. So they basically have a light hater flaw. Because the world's been in darkness for quite a while, they have learnt to live without the light. Their night vision's got better, and bright lights harm them. So when they're within the primary radii of light, then they take 1 hit of damage per round. And fire, even from sorcery, is treated as light. Basically anything that says it sheds light in a X radius is treated as harmful to light haters. We've got things such as objects just have hit values. So an iron door has 10 hits and you need to deal 10 hits worth of damage to it. Cover, again, if you're fully covered, you can't be hit, but you can't fight back either. If you're partly covered, you can fight at -1 and gain 2 defense. So being partly covered is quite useful. You can obviously be targeted as well. And concealment just provides a penalty to people's observation roles, task roles. Anybody can observe something, spot something. So concealing yourself will give you a slight edge. You can search for stuff. Takes around. You can search 5 foot square, and you can do that as many times as you like. And that way you can find traps, you can find secret doors and compartments, you can find tracks. So you can do all of that kind of stuff without having the skill. But having the feat and adding bonuses to it makes you much better at it. So with adversaries, let's pull up a bandit. So they have 1d4 fight dice, 1d4 task dice. They're not learned in the ways of sorcery. They have 1 defense. They're unarmored, but you could give them leather, which would add +2, or padded +1. They have 2 hits. They use clubs, which deal 1 hit of damage. Coin, frequently carrying 1d6 coin. They can move 30 feet, as all characters can. There are things that you can do to improve your movement, such as spells, and there's a feat as well. It's a natural feat, improved movement. They don't have any feats particularly, or flaws or incantations. So if we have a look at something like a hill giant, you can see that they've got a 1d20 fight die. They are nasty. They've got 28 hits, defense of 4, and they're hitting people with a tree trunk for 1d6, or they can throw a 1d10 boulder 30 feet. They have 40 coin, and there's a 4% chance of an artifact in there. So artifacts are magic, sorcerous items such as potions of health or magical daggers that shed light and that kind of thing. And there's a section on that later. So yeah, you can see that that some of these creatures are less fun than others. So skeleton, 1d4 fight dice, a 1d4 task dice, but if they're carrying a medium shield, it gives them that armor penalty, so -1. Sorcery, they're not sorceress. If they're carrying a medium shield, they've got a defense of 3, otherwise it's 1 unarmored. 2 hits. They can use spears, swords, axes, coin 1d6 at their burial location, move 30 feet. They've got night vision, which just allows them to see up to 100 feet as if it was daylight, so they don't suffer that penalty that humans and characters do, unless they've got magic that prevents it. Flaws, they're brittle, so blunt weapons cause an extra hit of damage for each successful strike. They've only got 2 hits anyway, so if you're using a mace and you manage to beat the defense with your fight die, then you're going to pretty much smash them to bits. The adversary section will be expanded. There will be a lot more, maybe skeletal knights and all that kind of goodness, but it's in its infancy at the moment, but it seems promising from the playtesting that I've done, so interesting.